Hi, Scott Harris King here again, and this time around I wanted to do something a little bit different. It's very easy to show off all the cool comics in my collection. Like in my last video, I showed off my Avengers #1 and stuff like that. And, go on YouTube, you can find lots of people doing that. But I haven't seen anyone who's brave enough to show off all the dumbest comics in their collection. I personally have a real soft spot for sort of amateur works or giveaways and just odd, quirky books, things that I just haven't seen before. And so I thought this time around I'd do, instead of my top 25 comics, we're going to do my not top 25, the 25 least key comics in my collection. And we're going to start the countdown here with number 25. It's The Fantastic Being. Yes, it's The Fantastic Being. This, as you can see, it co-stars the Job Mob. And this is a book that has a story where an alien crashes on Earth and a bunch of teenagers teach the alien how to get a job. This actually has some interest for collectors. It came out in 1981, and it has art by Bill Sienkiewicz, of all people. What I find strangest, though, about this is the fact that it's 35 cents. Like, you have to actually pay for this in order to learn how to get a job. This seems like the sort of thing that they would, give away to kids, teens, but no, you've got to pay in order to get this. So, your number 24, it's Super Boxers. This is original Marvel graphic novel. The best thing about it, quite clearly, is the awesome, very 80s cover here by, again, Bill Sienkiewicz. I promise that the entire 25 comics, they're not all his comics, because he's a great artist. But so the cover's really cool. It also has a really cool back cover. But here you get a little more of an idea of what the comic is about. It's about exactly what it sounds like. In the future, there are boxers who are super. I don't know. It's by Ron Wilson, obviously a boxing fan, but it's just one step above NFL Super Pro. And spoilers, we're going to be seeing some NFL Super Pro in just a little bit. Coming in at number 23, it's The Conqueror. Yes, The Conqueror. This is from 1984. Now, again, I mentioned earlier, I have a real soft spot for these sort of self-published indie books. In the 80s, there was this huge explosion of creators that, with the direct market coming into play, everybody was like, hey, I can do a comic book. And a lot of them are really bad, really amateurish, terrible stories, bad dialogue, bad art, and I love them because I love the enthusiasm. These are people that just want to make comics, who love comics, and they just put out their comics. Speaking as someone who writes and draws and self-publishes my own comic, even though I'm not a professional artist, I just really appreciate the dedication and the love of the art form that drives people to put out comics. Now, in this case, here's another comic that is definitely not key, but does actually have a little bit of interest for people. You'd never guess it by looking at the cover. But if you see the signature up here, bring that in a little closer. Yes, this cover, believe it or not, is actually by Brian Bolland. The inside actually is not bad. It's not bad, but it's basically a really dense Star Trek fanfic. But so I just love this sort of thing. Next up on the countdown, number 21, it's Blip. Number 3. This shell-shocked individual is described as being a TV star. Sure, I guess. It's just like he's probably one step ahead of Glenn Scarpelli in Hollywood. But yeah, so this was from Marvel. This is, I think, 82. They were trying to get in on this new video game craze, so they decided to put out this comic. Only part of it is a comic book. A lot of it are like articles about video games. For instance, there's like tips and tactics on how to play Centipede. So as a cultural artifact, it's interesting. There's also some comics in it, though. Of particular interest here is one of the first, or maybe the first, I haven't researched it too much, comic book appearances of Mario. Donkey Kong, this is about Donkey Kong, so Mario was popular at the time. So, again, some historical interest in terms of being like a good comic that you might actually want to have. No, it's terrible, but Blip. And coming in at number 21, it's Superman, Compliments of Radio Shack, co-starring the TRS-80 Computer Whiz Kids. Now, this is a giveaway from Radio Shack promoting the TRS-80 computer, which is basically a really glorified calculator. It also co-stars Supergirl. My favorite part about this is just the thought that Superman and Supergirl can't figure something out, so they have to use a TRS-80 programmed by small children in order to defeat the threat. Now, one thing that's cool about this is that it's actually done by the regular creative team. A lot of these giveaways they were done by whoever they could find off the street. But no, this is written by Carrie Bates, and it has the creative team of Kurt Swan on pencils, and those pencils are in the process of being systematically destroyed by inker Vince Colletta. So it's also got Lex Luthor in it, and it's got some great sequences like where they discover a gigantic TRS-80 computer. It's hard to do air quotes holding this computer, and they use this basically to teach the reader how to program their TRS-80. So, coming in at number 20, it's Barbaric Tales number 1. This is one of these self-published mid-80s, early 80s books, and there's several reasons that I have kept this book instead of chucking it in the recycle bin, which I think would be another fair use of it. But there's things about it that I really like. I appreciate this cover, which is the best part of the book. I actually kind of like the logo, and I like these cool armored dudes that almost have a little bit of a Kirby-esque design, with his sort of, he had these like Aztec influences later in his career. That's kind of what I'm seeing here. The cover is the best part of this. The interior, it has some stuff that's not that bad art-wise, but it also has some stuff like this, which is more, shall we say, aspirational, which again, I really like. I like seeing people putting their passion on the page. And that's evident here. If you look at the signature, you can see that it's signed 1982 and 1986. So it took him 4 years to draw this cover, and believe me, I totally get it. Doing my own comic, it took me a long time to figure out what I was doing. So, Barbaric Tales, number 1. Number 19, it's Archie's Car. So I'm trying to put together a complete run of all the Spire comics. For those who don't know, Al Hartley was an artist who worked for Atlas and Marvel, and then worked at Archie for a while. And he became a born-again Christian, and he started slipping these sort of Christian themes and stuff into the Archie books. And they weren't entirely on board with it, but what they did was they worked out a deal with Hartley where they licensed the rights to the characters to him, and he started his own line of Christian comics called Spire, and there's a whole bunch of these Archie books. I chose this one because it's not just a. Imagine yourself as a kid in the 70s. You want a comic. Do you really want a religious themed one? Do you want a religious themed Archie comic that's not even about Archie, but it's about his car? Probably not. And this has a bunch of sort of overt um, Christian messages in it. Here's Betty. In a lot of these stories, Betty is the one that's sort of teaching the rest of the gang about the messages of the Bible. I also love the fact that you can see in this panel there's some really strong continuity between all of these Spire Archie books where it refers them to a different one to learn about the Bible. This, like most of these, it has this great ad on the back for all the other Spire comics. Hansi, the girl who loved the swastika, is the only one of these that's really like a breakout sort of key that a lot of people try and get. The one I really want is actually Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. I'm a big Johnny Cash fan, and living up here in the north, I've never seen this. I'm guessing if I was looking at comics down south, it would be much easier to find copies of that. The same with the comic about Tom Landry, coach of the Dallas Cowboys. I've never seen either of those in person. So, we're going to be seeing another one of these come up later that is that's even less of a key than this. But here it is. It's Archie's car. Had to do it. I teased it earlier, as promised. It's NFL Super Pro. This is the Super Bowl special. This is the graphic novel that gives you the detailed origin of NFL Super Pro. In case you haven't read it, you don't need to. You can tell just from the cover exactly what it is. There's a guy, he's a football player. He undergoes this procedure to try and, he gets juiced up, basically, and he gets a little too juiced up, and he ends up with these superpowers, and he decides to fight football-themed crime. It's a guilty pleasure of mine. I have almost the entire run. The series that followed this, the monthly series, actually lasted 12 issues. The last few issues are pretty hard to find. I think I'm missing 9, 10, and 11. But they cross over into the regular Marvel universe. He teams up with Spider-Man in one issue and a Captain America in another issue. What's surprising about these is that they're actually really competent. It's got a lot of competent, workman-like creators like Jose Delbo and Bob Hall. And so, yeah, this has been sort of a fan joke for many years, and rightfully so. But it's a case where it's the work on it is good. The concept is just so stupid. Speaking of things that are kind of stupid, but hilariously so in a way that I've just got to keep in my collection, we have one of the new Teen Titans AntiDrug promotional handout comics. There's a few things that I like about this. For some reason, this is presented by the IBM Corporation. I don't know what they have to do with the anti-drug message. It also has on the inside front cover, it's a letter from Nancy Reagan, who of course at this time in the 80s was leading the war on drugs. That was not a very successful war. But you may also notice something a little bit odd about the Teen Titans. Yep, you see it, right? Who the hell is that guy? Here he is again. Who's that guy? And it's not just like they added some random character. It's actually a character that replaces Robin in the story. The story, what I've heard, is that for some weird reason, even though DC was doing the book themselves, there was some sort of rights issue where they couldn't use Robin in the comic. So instead they made up this character to replace him called the Protector. There he is again. And he has the same role on the team as Robin. He's the team leader. Here he is giving a speech. I don't know who designed that mask, but it's absolutely laughably horrible. And then the story is all about them trying to convince kids that drugs are bad, and various things happen, and they fight evil in the form of drug dealers. Um, but yeah, and then there's a worksheet in the back where you can learn from the mistakes of the characters, and you just fill this out. Apparently, whoever got this originally didn't really feel the need to do that. So, not gonna probably be featured in the cartoon anytime soon. It's the Protector, leader of the Teen Titans. Finally, for this batch here, it's number 16, Punchy and the Black Crow, number 10. So you can see this is a Charlton book, but it's not just any Charlton book. Keep an eye out when you're in the box diving for this stripe here with the 75-cent price point. These are the last Charltons ever printed. At the end of 1985, going into 1986, Charlton, which hadn't put any comics out for several years at that point, since like 83, did this last gasp thing where they did a whole bunch of reprint books. And to try and get back in the marketplace, they have this stripe, they have the 75-cent logo, and this is one of the weirdest of them to me. It's Punchy and the Black Crow, where they took these 1940s funny animal stories and reprinted them for a mid-80s audience. Needless to say, the humor that kids were looking for in 1986 and the end of 85 is very different from what they were looking for in 1947. So when I saw this in a dollar box, I was like, is it worth $1? No. But it's not that easy to find. You can pick it up cheap because no one wants to find it. But sometimes people like me accidentally find it, and it's found its way into my collection. Punching the Black Crow. Seamless transition. Definitely all filmed at the same time. Okay, here we go with the next one up. I've got a few here in a run from Marvel, including some comics I think you'll know, some infamously questionable comics, but despite that, they still hold a soft spot in my heart. Starting here at number 15, it's Team America, number 1. So for those who haven't actually read Team America, let's face it, as most people, this is about a group of motorcycle stunt people who turn out that they have this weird power. When they're all together, they can form this entity called the Black Rider or the Black Marauder or something. This dude here, who is like also a motorcycle stuntman, but with extra powers. Later on, after the end of this series, they ended up appearing in New Mutants, where it was discovered that they're actually mutants, but it's a group mutation, so their mutant ability only works when they're all together. And of course, that's not cool because there's a lot of interpersonal conflict between the members. I like it. You know, it's really cheesy and it's really goofy, and it's also clearly one of these projects that they put together because they wanted to get some sort of licensing deal to make Team America toys. They tried a bunch of these things during the 80s, and pretty much none of them really worked. But they also had a cool crossover with Captain America that's probably the best use of the team. So Team America, only slightly less notorious than US 1. These two, I think, are a package deal. They kind of go together. That's why I'm sort of featuring them back to back. US 1 is a series about a truck driver who has a souped up super truck, and he's got this cybernetic implant, which you see here, that allows him to sort of have a mind meld with his truck. So he and the truck are one, and he fights a lot of trucker themed supervillains. My grandfather was a truck driver, so I have a bias towards stories about truckers in comics. I have a little like a subset of comics that involve truck driver covers. But US 1 is about as cheesy as it gets. It's not, however, the top ranking Marvel book in my countdown here, because coming in at number 13 in the least key comics in my collection, it's Sweet 16, number 1. Now, I've got this soft spot for Marvel titles that I've never heard of before and never seen before. And during this period in the late 80s and early 90s, there's a ton of them. Marvel was throwing all sorts of weird ideas at the wall, but there were a lot of stuff that either didn't make it into the direct market or wasn't really designed to sell in the direct market. In this case, this was a direct market comic, but considering that it's clearly aimed at preteen girls, there just weren't that many preteen girls visiting comic book stores in like 1990. So needless to say, this series didn't last that long. This is a story about a 16-year-old girl in ancient Rome, and the art all looks like this, and it's sort of like what if Archie took place 2,000 years ago and was sort of drawn by someone with a little bit of like a cubist influence. So yeah, I saw this. I had to pick it up because I'd never heard of it. There's several. I have a bunch of Marvel titles that I picked up just because I had no idea Marvel put them out. Like a couple that didn't make my countdown here. I've got a comic called Cops: The Job, which was from Marvel. I've got one from the 70s called Lil Pals. So, there's a bunch of weird Marvel series. Timmy the Timid Ghost. Most people probably haven't seen that one. That's a series from like 1968. So anyway, Sweet 16. Next up at number 12, another Marvel. It's House 2, the second story. Another thing Marvel was doing, particularly in the 80s, was a bunch of movie adaptations. They did a lot of miniseries, a lot of one-shots, a lot of graphic novels adapting different movies, and some of them make sense. I've got the Blade Runner adaptation. That's really cool. Return of the Jedi. That's cool. Some of them, though, I don't understand why they would ever have put this out. I don't know, like the movie wasn't particularly popular and it was very bad. The only reason I picked this up, besides being such an obscure thing to exist, is that my friend Rob, who also is a comic collector, and I, we both saw this movie, back in the late 80s, and both thought it was just terrible and ridiculously cheesy. So House 2 sort of became like a running joke between us. So when I picked this up, I had to buy it, and it's remained in my collection basically as an inside joke. It's still not the most obscure Marvel movie adaptation in my collection, though. That belongs to this. At number 11, it's Pinocchio and the Emperor of the Night. So if you've never heard of this movie, nobody has heard of this movie. But this is an adaptation of an animated sequel to Pinocchio, but not from Disney, because of course the Pinocchio story is in public domain. So yeah, this is just inexplicable. I saw this in a like a quarter bin, and I had to buy it just so I could find out what the hell this thing is. And it's just, yeah, it's like this kid's story about Pinocchio, blah blah blah. There's an Emperor of the Night in it. It's one of these ones where Marvel was trying like way too hard, just but you gotta love this sort of obscure stuff. Anytime I see a comic, I've been reading comics now for getting close to 40 years. So anytime I see one, particularly from an era where I was buying them new, and I've never seen it before, I've got to pick it up just out of sheer curiosity. All right, coming from the golden age of comics to remind you why comics were so great, it's number 10, Spaceman Discovers Christmas. Now, I'm being only partially sarcastic here because the premise is so goofy. It's about an alien who comes to Earth and discovers the true meaning of Christmas by interacting with Santa Claus. But this book is actually in some demand because the charming interior artwork was done by the studio of Will Eisner. It's not known for sure whether Eisner drew it himself or if he just supervised the artwork, but it's from Eisner's studio. So it has some really cool artwork. But, I mean, it's just so ridiculous, which is the thing I love about comics. Just how you can take any goofy premise and just go with it, you know? Just go with it. Speaking of which, brings us to number 9. Someone in the 80s asked themselves, what if Aquaman was a lizard? And then self-published Sea Dragon. Now, this book is much better than it has any right to be. When you take that premise and the fact that it's, you know, basically amateur comic enthusiasts making their own book, you would expect it to be absolutely terrible, but it's surprisingly competent. When you look at the artwork inside, like here's the splash page, and then you see some of the later sequences, like some of these pages here. It's actually pretty good. Like, it's pretty well done. The people that put this together were actually pretty competent. And in the end, we get introduced to Twilight, this like angel lady warrior, and you're like, oh, now what happens? But I don't know. I don't have the next issue. So again, this is one of these books where you pick it up, you think it's going to be absolutely terrible. It should be terrible, but surprisingly, it's you can see the promise in it, you know. And I just love the enthusiasm. And this is actually not the least key book in my collection that features Sea Dragon. So there's a little tease. The next book, though, does not feature Sea Dragon. It's called Life Brigade #1. Just want you to get a really good look at the artwork here. Really take a look at that. This book is really odd because it's basically a superhero book, but it's drawn with a very heavy sort of underground comics with an X art aesthetic, which you can really see on the back cover, which like Daffy Duck is some sort of crazed samurai. And so the art style inside, like, I could see underground comics people really digging this. I get it. And yet it's such an almost jarring mix of superhero stuff with this underground art style that it's just really weird. And then there's a bunch of like interesting pinups and stuff in the back by different people. Here's a backup story that actually has some really cool underground style artwork. So yeah, it's a book that I obviously wanted to keep. I've kept it in my collection, and yet, you know, it's about as 10-cent bin as you can get while still maintaining enough interest to hold on to. It's also significantly better than the next comic on my list. Here it is. Get a close look at that. It's the Epsilon Wave, #1. And the Epsilon Wave gets props for being a mid-80s indie book that's actually in full color. But this is a book where the ambition sort of outstripped the skill level. However, as an extra bonus, in the back, That's right. It's a sea dragon backup story in full color. So, yeah, we get like the origin of Sea Dragon. So that's Epsilon Wave number 1. And finally, coming in at number 6 on my list of my least key comics, it's Mythos number 1. Take here, I just want to show you this. The book has this clearly Kirby inspired look to it, which a lot of these indie books do. We're going to have one later on in my top 2 that's Kirby inspired in one of the weirdest ways possible. The interior art actually has some panels and stuff that to me are very reminiscent of being Ditko inspired. Like if you take a look at that woman's face there, it's very Ditko. And the story in this is actually pretty interesting. It's basically, there's like this frontier couple, basically. They're on another planet or the moon or something. And times are tough. They've got this robot, and the wife and the child in particular become very, very close to the robot, and the father gets more and more jealous of the robot. And at the end of the story, the robot's malfunctioning, so the wife and the kid, they want to spend like all their money to fix the robot. The guy flips out on the robot and tries to destroy it, and then when he does, there's this electrical shock that backfires, and it switches their minds. So the father's mind goes in the robot body, and the robot dies, but the robot's mind is transferred into the father's body. So at the end, the wife and the child are like, awesome. So it was actually a pretty interesting story. This is a book that I think, like a lot of these, there's potential. I can see the potential. It's just, one of these things where it was a little unfinished for the skill level of the person doing it. And if they had 3 or 4 more years of work, this might have been really good. As it is, it's interesting, and I really appreciate the effort put into Mythos number 1. Here we are, number 5. It's Messiah. Look at their faces. Look at this guy's face. Okay, this is another comic where the ambition sort of outstripped the skill level, but it's got kind of an interesting story, actually. Basically what happens is this woman here is sent to Earth from this alien planet, kind of like Superman, and she's spreading this sort of message of hope and peace and etc. to this war-torn Earth. And basically this televangelist guy sort of starts manipulating her for his own ends, and tries to sort of use her to control like the message going out, so he can sort of gain spiritual control over the world. And she ends up falling in love with this guy who's like her liaison to Earth, and they have a child. And there's an interesting sequence where she gets pregnant and has to stop preaching to the world, and so everyone's just like, okay, I guess that's over with. So it's unusual. Just imagine if Superman was just gone for 9 months because he had to have a baby. I'm not sure that would sort of fly these days, but basically at the end, the preacher hijacks a nuclear missile and sends it to like blow something up, and she comes out of retirement and stops the missile, but at the cost of her own life. At the end of the issue, though, we see her spirit is still alive and ascends to wherever it is that the rest of her alien race are at. But also we see that her child has inherited some of her alien powers. This is continued in the second issue, which I don't have. There's an ad for it here. It's called Aftermath. And that's less interesting, though, than this ad for their newest series, Lavender. And I guess it's sort of like a Gem meets Dazzler sort of thing, maybe. But I just love this drawing here with this side eye. She's like, ee. That comic unfortunately never came out. Trust me, I've tried to research this because I desperately wanted to get a copy of Lavender, but unfortunately it's not around. But what is around here is I promised another Spire comic, and here it is. It's Corey Ten Boom's The Hiding Place. Now, let me say right up front that Corey Ten Boom's The Hiding Place, it's a classic memoir of the Holocaust, and it's, literally required reading. It was on my reading list when I was in grade school, and it's an important educational and moving novel. So why do I have it here? Well, while I applaud Al Hartley's efforts in getting this story out to broader masses through the comic book medium, it's the cover. Because if you ever wanted to know what a concentration camp cover drawn by Archie artists looked like, unfortunately you don't have to wonder, because someone actually did it. Yes, it's Al Hartley, Archie artist, doing a concentration camp scene. Again, I don't really have any problem with the contents, but this is an issue where you see the pitfalls of being your own editor, because there wasn't anyone around to say, Al, maybe you shouldn't do the Holocaust cover in the Archie style, because of this. So yeah, there it is, number 4 on my list. Number 3, it's Superfan 1999. Now, I think I overpaid for this, and what I mean is I paid 10 cents for it, and that's 5 probably would have been better. This is a wackadoodle comic from around 1990 that's a satirical look at political relations between the United States and Cuba, as told through the lens of a hardcore baseball fan. As far as I can tell from trying to read it, the World Series winning baseball team, their plane gets hijacked and taken to Cuba, where they're forced to play a baseball game against a bunch of hand-picked Cuban players that Fidel Castro has chosen to represent them. And like a full-scale war basically breaks out in the middle of the game, and the day is saved by this regular Joe who's just a huge fan of baseball, who flies down to rescue everybody. And it involves there's like an FBI agent or something who is dressed in like the San Diego chicken costume, and it's just so weird. I don't really understand the thought process behind making this comic. It's just a real head scratcher, and as a fan of weird comics, there's few things as entertaining as wondering just why this even exists. So that's why this is remain in my collections. But my top 2 are on a different level, really. It's Tales of Wonder number 3, God's favorite comic magazine. Possibly my favorite thing about this is that it's number 3. I've never found issues 1 or 2, but believe me, if I find them, I'm buying them right away. This comic is basically Tales from the Bible, but the whole book is done as though it were a mid-60s Marvel book. So it's written with this Stan Lee sort of hyperbole. There's all these like fake house ads and a letter column, and it's all done just in the Stan Lee 60s Marvel style. The art, on the other hand, I don't know if you can tell. See all this, like, I think this is supposed to be grass, but it's just like this worm stuff, and then his hair. That's the predominant feature of the artwork on the inside. Here's the inside front cover. And then the splash page. Look at the hair. And then that's just like the tip of the hairberg. This is the story, by the way, of Adam and Eve. So there's Eve, and everything's just like hyper violent, and everyone's like screaming and grimacing. It's taking this like sort of Jack Kirby style of exaggeration and going absolutely berserk with it in the service of telling the story of the Bible. Look, here's Eve again. This is Eve, and she's like, this is the sequence in the Bible where she's being basically cursed by God because she bit into the apple. And like the whole story, the comic is like this. It's crazy, like brought low in the wilderness. Here's a tease for the next issue. I don't know if it ever came out. But I certainly haven't found it, and I've been looking. But again, there's also these things here, which are like fake Marvel style ads. We want you to join the PPS, or the letter column, Males of Wonder, right? And their Marvel value stamp. So it's a real dedication. Like this, the person that did this is a super hardcore comic fan, but the melding of that aesthetic, that 60s Marvel over the top aesthetic with these Bible stories is so unintentionally hilarious. And I think it's unintentional because this is supposed to be like, this is marketed for religious readers that it's the disconnect. The cognitive dissonance that this causes for me is absolutely worth the price of buying it. And that brings me to my number one comic. Hope you're ready. The least key comic in my collection. It's the Invincible 4 of Kung Fu and Ninja. Not only does this comic promise to be the only comic to teach you real Kung Fu and Ninja application, more importantly, as you can see here, it will teach you the incredible technique of standing on real eggs. And it actually does. If you go to the back of the comic, there's a 2-page photo spread explaining how you can safely stand on a carton of eggs without breaking them. The comic itself, though, it's a full color, like double-sized Kung Fu comic that's kind of like a really bad Jackie Chan movie. It's got all these action sequences, and there's like a lady with a parasol in danger, and guys with axes and throwing stars and all sorts of just like craziness. And then when you get to the back of the book, as promised, there's instruction guides on how to properly do different kung fu and ninja moves. This comic also has advertisement. Here's another comic from the same company. It's called Wing Sun Kung Fu. I have never seen this, and it says on it, a special comic book with high collectible value. That's debatable. I would say there's some collectible value, because if I ever run into it, like in a dollar box, I will definitely be collecting it. But this comic has ads in here where you could take out a full year subscription to the comic. I think that's a little ambitious. I noticed this in a lot of these where they're like, yeah, send us, X amount of dollars and you'll get the next 6 issues. No, there weren't 6 more issues. It does have the nice gold foil on it though, so it's in some ways it's hard to understand why the Invincible 4 of Kung Fu and Ninja didn't do a little bit better. So there you have it, the top 25 least key books in my collection. And I want to stress again, like, they're in my collection. Comics that are completely boring, I get rid of them. But comics that like these that are so weird or bad or inexplicable that they're entertaining, I want to hold on to. So I'm a big fan of offbeat comics. I have a whole bunch more. Some of them are legitimately far too good to appear on lists like this. Like I'm a huge fan, non-ironically, of Night Nurse. I love Prez. Basically anything from Joe Simon in the 70s. If you haven't read Championship Sports or Strange Sports Stories, like I love all of those things. But yeah, so this has been a little look. I would love to see what you think. I'd love to see other people's worst comics. You know they're there. You know that at the bottom of that bottom long box, buried under all your X-Men back issues, there's those comics where you're like, why did I get this? It's so bad. But you haven't gotten rid of it yet. Well, let me know. Uh, post those in the comments. Let me see your most embarrassing and inexplicable comic books in your collection. And thanks for watching. If you like this video, I'm kind of new to YouTube, so I'm still learning some of the aspects, but I think you can, there's a button on one of these sides where you can subscribe. I think there's a thing where you can like down here, and then there's a bell maybe, and when you hit that, it'll notify you. I'm trying to get up to 50 subscribers, and when I get to 50, I'll announce a cool new thing. I'm not 100% sure what that's going to be, but I've got some ideas. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.